He stopped at the door, his hand sweating on the doorknob, his heart pounding erratically. Inside, Augustus's voice, low and venomous, reached his ears. "She's not who you think she is, boss. This woman will destroy everything you've built." A lump formed in his throat. He turned to Helen, who looked at him with eyes full of a silent plea, and doubt, like a cold blade, pierced his soul. Before we dive into this story, leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The dawn was still stretching lazily over Sunrise Ranch when the rhythmic sound of horse hooves cut through the damp silence of the corrals. Anthony, the owner of those lands, walked with his lantern raised, the yellow light dancing over the beaten earth floor. His blue eyes, hard as steel, swept the gloom with the attention of someone who knows every inch of that place and senses when something is out of order. The previous night's rain had left a trail of humidity in the air, a strong smell of wet earth that mingled with the familiar scent of hay and leather. This was his world, an empire built with the sweat of generations, a place where every sound and every smell told a story. He was 43 years old, but his early widowhood, 5 years ago, had given him a gravity that made him seem older. Since his beloved wife, Clara, had passed, Anthony had retreated into a shell of silence and work. Laughter in the manor house had become rare, and joy, a distant memory too painful to revisit. The rancher was a respected man in the region, known for his integrity and his firm word, but also for a deep sorrow that had settled in his heart and that no one dared to dis. As he approached the main stable, a strange sensation enveloped him. It wasn't the noise of the animals, which was constant and comforting, but a different silence, a weight in the air that shouldn't be there. He slowly pushed open the solid wooden door, and the loud creak of the hinge echoed through. The sound was followed by a contained, almost inaudible sigh which made his body stiffen. He raised the lantern a little higher, and the beam of light revealed a scene that left him paralyzed. There, nestled between the shadows and the soft straw, was a woman. She was lying on her side, her body curled against the cold, her face pale and dirty, framed by long, completely disheveled brown hair. What most caught his attention, however, was her swollen belly, which stood out beneath her simple, torn dress. She was pregnant, and by the size of her belly, the baby wouldn't be long in coming. The lantern light made her stir, and her eyes, large and haunted, opened and stared at him. There was a mixture of fear and dignity in that gaze, an attempt to rise, to compose herself, even in a situation of extreme vulnerability. She didn't say a word. She didn't ask for shelter, didn't plead for help. She merely lowered her eyes, a gesture of resignation that seemed more eloquent to Anthony than any request. It was as if asking were a luxury reserved for those who still had some hope, and she seemed to have exhausted her. He remained there, standing, the silence between them filled only by the cold wind entering through the cracks in the wooden walls and the distant clinking of the horses' chains, which seemed like a silent prayer in that early morning. Anthony was a man accustomed to making quick and firm decisions, giving orders and being obeyed. But before that fragile and helpless figure, he felt disoriented. His first reaction was one of distrust. Who was this woman? Where had she come from? What was she doing on his land? But, looking at her more closely, he saw the tremor in her hands, her lips purple with cold and compassion. A feeling he thought he had buried along with his wife began to bloom in his chest. Without much thought, he took off the thick wool coat he was wearing and offered it to her. It was an instinctive gesture, devoid of words, but loaded with meaning. She hesitated for an instant, as if she couldn't believe such an act of kindness, but the cold was stronger than her distrust. She accepted the coat with trembling hands. Her lips parted, and he could see the effort she made to contain the tears that threatened to overflow. "What's your name?" His voice deep and a little hoarse. "Helen." Her voice so low it was almost muffled by the wind. Anthony asked no more questions. He knew it wasn't the time. There was a greater urgency in the situation. "Come, You can't stay here." He helped her up, noticing how weak she was. He supported her with his arm and guided her out of the stable, towards the manor house, which stood imposingly a few yards away. The lantern light accompanied them, casting their elongated shadows on the dirt ground. For the servants, who were already beginning to wake and saw the scene from afar, the image was unusual. The boss, always so reclusive and austere, supporting an unknown pregnant woman in the middle of the night. Inside the house, the warmth of the wood-fired kitchen welcomed them. The maids, led by Mrs. Lucia, an elderly woman with white hair and a generous heart, who had worked for Anthony's family her entire life, looked at the scene with astonishment. The whispers began immediately, spreading through the corridors like wildfire. Who was this woman? A lost soul, a fugitive, perhaps a woman of ill repute who had come seeking shelter. Anthony ignored the stares and murmurs. His only concern was for the woman who could barely stand. "Lucia, prepare a room for her, the small one, near the kitchen, and bring her something warm to drink." Mrs. Lucia, despite her surprise, obeyed promptly. She was loyal to Anthony and trusted his judgment, even when she didn't understand it. She guided Helen to a small room at the back of the house, a simple but clean and cozy space. She gave her dry clothes, a mug of warm milk with honey, and left her to rest. Anthony stayed in the kitchen, looking out the window as the day began to lighten on the horizon. The image of Helen, with her frightened eyes and her vulnerability, couldn't get out of his head. He knew nothing about her, but he felt an inexplicable responsibility for that life that destiny had placed in his path. There was something about her, a silent strength, a dignity that resisted misery, that had touched him in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. In the days that followed, Helen's presence on the ranch became the main topic among the employees. The speculations were many, but Anthony remained silent. He limited himself to observing her from afar, with the serenity of someone trying to understand. He saw her sitting on the back, sewing small pieces of clothing for the baby about to arrive, her eyes lost in the green vastness of the fields. He saw the delicacy with which she cared for the garden flowers, the sweetness with which she treated the animals, the silent gratitude in her gaze every time she received a meal. Helen, for her part, tried to remain invisible. She knew that her presence was uncomfortable, that she was the target of curious and suspicious glances. Therefore, she dedicated herself to household tasks with zeal. She helped Mrs. Lucia in the kitchen, washed clothes, sewed. She wanted, in some ways, to repay the hospitality she had received. Slowly, with her kindness and her willingness to work, she won the sympathy of the other women in the house. The smell of fresh bread she baked in the wood-fired stove, the sound of chickens scratching in the yard at dawn, the murmur of the prayers she whispered before sleeping, all of this began to fill a space that was once empty of meaning in the manor house. Anthony observed her and felt, against his will, something he had long thought dead within him, a curiosity, a tenderness, a desire for protection. He remembered Clara, how she too loved to care for the garden, how her laughter filled every corner of that house. They were painful memories, but for the first time in 5 years, they were not accompanied by an overwhelming emptiness. Helen's presence, somehow, brought a breath of life to that place dormant with sorrow. He found himself thinking about her during the day, imagining her story, her fears, her dreams, and at night, before sleeping, the image of her frightened eyes in the stable returned to his mind, awakening in him a new and disconcerting feeling, a mixture of compassion and something more, something he didn't yet dare to name. Weeks passed, and Helen's belly grew, announcing the imminent arrival of a new life. The routine at Sunrise Ranch adapted to her presence. The maids, once suspicious, now treated her with maternal affection, especially Mrs. Lucia, who had adopted her like a daughter. She taught her the secrets of the kitchen, told her stories of Anthony's family, and protected her from the malicious comments that still circulated in the corners. Helen, in turn, flourished in that environment. The fear in her eyes gave way to a tranquil serenity. The work on the ranch gave her purpose, and the kindness of the people made her feel, for the first time in a long time, safe. She spent hours sitting on the porch, sewing the baby's layette with fabric scraps she received from Mrs. Lucia. Each stitch was a promise of a better future, a hope she wove with her own hands. Anthony continued to observe her from a distance. He was a silent spectator of that transformation. He saw the sparkle returning to her eyes, the timid smile that appeared on her lips when she played with the ranch dog, the way her hand caressed her belly with infinite love. He was attracted by that silent strength, by that ability to find beauty and hope amidst adversity. It was a stark contrast to his own grief, which kept him tied to a past that would never return. He avoided long conversations with them. They exchanged only formal greetings, necessary words about the day's tasks. But their gazes often met, and in those brief moments, a silent communication. He saw gratitude and she saw concern in his. It was a tenuous but real connection that grew daily, despite both of them. One afternoon, the autumn sun bathed the fields in a golden light. It was harvest season, and the ranch buzzed with activity. Men and women worked side by side, the sound of their voices and laughter mingling with the noise of the tools. Helen, feeling stronger, insisted on helping. She wanted to feel useful, part of that community that had welcomed her. Mrs. Lucia tried to dissuade her, worried about her advanced state of pregnancy, but Helen was stubborn. She took a basket and began to pick the lowest oranges, the citrus scent permeating the air around her. Anthony was on top of the hill, on horseback, supervising the work. From there he had a privileged view of the entire property. His eyes, as always, were drawn to Helen's figure. He watched her for a long time, admiring her determination. A discreet smile bloomed on his lips, a smile no one had seen in years. But suddenly the smile vanished. He saw Helen stumble, put her hand to her head, and then collapse to the ground, the basket of oranges rolling beside her. His heart froze. Without a second thought, he spurred his horse and galloped down the hill, panic taking hold of him. The other workers ran to help her, but Anthony arrived first. He jumped off his horse before it had even fully stopped and knelt beside her. "Helen, Helen, speak to me," he called, his voice choked with worry. She was pale, her lips colorless, her breath faint. He picked her up in his arms, feeling how light she was, despite her pregnancy. He crossed the yard under the astonished gaze of all the employees, who silently made way. They had never seen him so distraught, so human. The boss, the Iron Man, displayed a vulnerability no one imagined he possessed. He carried her into the manor house, not to the small room in the back, but to his own guest room, the best. He laid her on the soft bed and yelled for Mrs. Lucia. "Call Dr. Mendez in town, quickly." While they waited for the doctor, Anthony stayed by her side, holding her cold hand, wiping the sweat from her forehead with a damp cloth. He felt helpless, and the fear of losing her, of also losing that child who hadn't even been born yet, consumed him. At that moment, he realized the depth of what he felt for her. It wasn't just compassion, it was something stronger, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel since Clara's death. When Helen finally awoke, the dimness of the room enveloped her. The first thing she saw was Anthony's face, his expression divided between relief and a severity that couldn't hide his tenderness. "You shouldn't have been alone," he murmured, his voice deep, firm, but imbued with a tenderness that made her blush. She didn't know what to answer. She merely made a gesture with her hand, touching the soft sheet, without the courage to lift her gaze and face the intensity she saw in his eyes. She felt ashamed for having caused such a commotion, for having become the center of attention in such a dramatic way. The doctor arrived shortly after, and after examining her, reassured everyone. It had only been a faint, caused by fatigue and the heat. The pregnancy was fine, and the baby healthy. He recommended absolute rest until the day of delivery. From that day on, everything changed. Helen was permanently moved to the guest room, and Anthony personally took over her care. He brought her meals, made sure she took her medicine, and spent hours sitting in an armchair beside her bed, reading in silence or simply watching her. This forced proximity broke down the barriers they had built around themselves. They began to talk, timidly, about trivial things. The weather, the harvest, the ranch animals. Gradually, the conversations became longer, deeper. Helen told him about her childhood in the countryside, about her dreams of being a teacher, about the loneliness she felt. She didn't talk about the child's father, and he didn't ask. He respected her silence, understanding that there were wounds that weren't yet ready to be touched. Anthony, in turn, also opened up. He spoke about his love for that land, about the longing he felt for Clara, about the weight of the responsibility of carrying his family's legacy. Helen listened to him with an attention and an empathy that disarmed him. She didn't see him as the boss, the powerful man, but as a human being who suffered, who had fears and frailties. On a rainy night, when the sound of thunder made the house tremble, Helen had a nightmare. She woke up startled, crying. Anthony, who was in the next room, heard her sobs and rushed to her aid. He sat on the edge of the bed and, without saying a word, simply hugged her. It was an awkward hug, from someone unaccustomed to gestures of affection, but it conveyed a security and comfort that Helen hadn't felt in a long time. She cried on his shoulder, releasing all the pain and fear she had held within herself, and he let her cry, stroking her hair, feeling her heart calm against his. In that embrace, in the silence of the night, something was sealed between them. It wasn't love yet, but it was the beginning of something. It was the certainty that they were no longer alone in their pain. They were two wounded souls who had found each other, and together were beginning to find a path. Sunrise Ranch, which for so long had been a place of mourning and silence, began to fill with a new hope, a hope born of compassion and the promise of a new life that was about to arrive. The first contraction came on a cold morning, announced by a low moan that cut the silence of the manor house. Anthony, who had been sleeping lightly since Helen's faint, jumped up and ran to her room. He found her sitting on the bed, her face contorted in pain, her hands clutching her belly. Started, her voice trembling. The panic Anthony had felt on the day of her faint returned with full force. For an instant, he was paralyzed, unsure what to do, but Helen's gaze, a mix of pain and plea, brought him back to reality. He needed to be strong for her. Calm down. Everything will be all right. I'm here with you, trying to convey a reassurance he himself didn't feel. He yelled for Mrs. Lucia, who appeared in seconds, already knowing what was happening. The old woman was experienced with births, and took command of the situation with impressive calm. She told one of the maids to boil water, another to fetch clean towels, and asked Anthony to leave the room. "This is women's work, Mike Shreve, boss. You'll only get in the way," she said, with the authority that years of service conferred upon her. Anthony hesitated. The idea of leaving her alone at that moment was unbearable. But he knew Lucia. He had no experience with this. Reluctantly, he left the room and stayed outside, pacing back and forth in the corridor, his hands on his heart in his mouth. The hours dragged on and agonized. Helen's moans grew louder, more desperate. Each cry was like a knife in Anthony's chest. He felt useless, helpless. He wished he could do something to relieve her pain, but all he could do was wait, and the sun was already high when, finally, a different sound echoed through the corridor, a sharp, strong, vibrant cry, the cry of a newborn. Anthony stopped pacing, his body tense, his breath held. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst from his chest. The bedroom door opened and Mrs. Lucia appeared, her face tired but radiant. In her arms, wrapped in a white sheet, was a small bundle. "It's a girl, boss. Strong and healthy," she announced, with a smile that lit up her wrinkled face. Anthony felt such immense relief that his legs weaked. He approached, hesitant, and looked at the small being in her arms. She was tiny, her face red and wrinkled, her eyes closed, her mouth opening in a vigorous cry. A fair-skinned girl with dark hair, who seemed to bring peace back to that place. "And Helen, how is she?" His voice hoarse with emotion. "She's tired, but she was a warrior." The newborn's cry echoed through the house like an unexpected blessing, a sound of life that broke the spell of sadness that had hung over the ranch for years. The employees, who had gathered in the kitchen, curious, and apprehensive, smiled with relief. That child, daughter of an unknown woman, was already part of the Sunrise family. Mrs. Lucia handed him the girl. Anthony held her with trembling, clumsy hands. He was afraid of hurting her. She seemed so fragile. But as soon as the little one snuggled into his arms, an overwhelming feeling took hold of him, a pure, unconditional love, which he hadn't felt since his own daughter, who had died in childbirth along with Clara, had been taken from him. He looked at the girl's face and, for an instant, saw Clara's eye. A solitary tear ran down, a tear he hadn't allowed himself to cry in 5 years. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of a complex emotion, a mixture of longing, joy, and redemption. With the girl in his arms, he made a decision. He crossed the corridor and headed for a part of the house he avoided at all, the room where his late wife had passed. The door was always locked, and no one was allowed to enter. It was a sanctuary of his pain, a place where time had stopped. He turned the key in the lock and pushed the door open. The room was exactly as Clara had left. The bed made, dresses in her perfume still in the air. The memories hit him like a punch to the gut. But this time he didn't recoil. He entered the room and walked to the wooden crib he had built himself for the daughter he never knew. With infinite care, he laid the little one in the crib. The girl stopped crying and opened her eyes for the first time. They were large and brown, curious, and stared at him with an intensity that disarmed him. At that moment, Anthony knew that his life had changed forever. That child was a new beginning, a gift from destiny that he didn't know he deserved. He knelt beside the crib and stayed there, just watching her, his heart overflowing with a love he thought he had. The silent emotion was noticed by Mrs. Lucia, who watched him from the doorway, her eyes moist. No one in the house dared to comment, but everyone understood the meaning of that gesture. The boss was finally coming out of his mourning. When Helen had recovered enough to get up, Anthony took her to see their daughter. She entered Clara's room with reverence, feeling the presence of the other woman in that place. Seeing the girl sleeping peacefully in the crib, her eyes filled with tears. "She's beautiful." "Yes, she is," Anthony agreed, standing beside her. "What will her name be?" Helen thought for a moment, her gaze lost in the immensity of the sky visible through the window. "Victoria? Because she is my victory." "Victoria?" Anthony repeated, liking the sound. "It's a beautiful name." Victoria's arrival transformed the dynamic of the house. The baby's cries and laughter filled the silence that had once reigned. Helen dedicated herself entirely to her daughter, a love that overflowed her and healed all her wounds. Anthony, in turn, became a surrogate father. He spent hours playing with the girl, giving her bottles, changing her diapers. The employees looked at him with astonishment and admiration. The stern and reserved man had given way to a caring and present one. Their closeness in caring for the child united them even more. They became partners in sharing joys, and conversations became more intimate. Barriers completely fell. They laughed together Victoria's antics, worried together when she had colic, and were moved together by each new discovery. The unease in Anthony's hardened heart began to transform into something more. He tried to maintain distance, to remember that he was the boss and she, a dependent. But it was impossible. He was attracted by Helen's humble serenity, which contrasted with the pride and calculation of women of his social. He admired her strength, her resilience, the unconditional love she dedicated to her daughter. He was falling in love, and that scared him more than anything else. Helen also felt the weight of that closeness. The gratitude she felt for Anthony was immense, but it was mingling with other feelings. She felt attracted by his kindness, by his protective gaze, by the way he treated her daughter as if she were his own. But guilt gnawed at her. She knew that her presence in that house, in that ambiguous position, could be misinterpreted. She was a woman without a past, without a name, and he, a rich and respected rancher. A social chasm separated them, and however much her heart wished otherwise, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong there, that her happiness was a loan that would one day have to be repaid, and this uncertainty prevented her from fully surrendering to the feeling that was growing within her. The apparent harmony that had settled over Sunrise Ranch with Victoria's arrival, however, did not please everyone. There was one person who watched the growing closeness between Anthony and Helen with eyes heavy with resentment and envy. Augustus, the ranch foreman. Augustus was a middle-aged man, vain and ambitious. He had worked for Anthony's family since he was young and, over time, had gained the boss's trust, becoming his right-hand man. He was the one who managed the finances, negotiated with buyers, supervised the employees. Accustomed to being Anthony's trusted voice, he saw himself as a figure of power on the ranch, almost a second owner. Since Clara's death, Augustus's influence over Anthony had grown even more. The rancher, immersed in his grief, had delegated most decisions to him, isolating himself in manual labor and the solitude of the manor house. Augustus delighted in this position, feeling indispensable and manipulating situations to his advantage whenever he could. Helen's arrival, however, completely changed this scenario. For the first time in years, Anthony seemed to be awakening from his lethargy. He had returned to taking an interest in business, participating in decisions, circulating through the house, and talking to employees. And the reason for this change, to Augustus's despair, was that mysterious woman who had appeared out of nowhere. Augustus saw Helen's presence as a veiled threat. It wasn't just jealousy of the affection Anthony showed for her and the child, but a real fear of losing his prestige, his influence, his place of power. He noticed that Anthony listened to Helen's opinions, that he valued her presence, and this drove him mad. That simple woman, uneducated and nameless, was occupying a space he considered his by right. Determined to undermine Helen's position and regain the boss's exclusive attention, Augustus began to act with venomous dissimulation. To Anthony, he maintained a facade of courtesy and concern. He praised the boss's kindness in taking in the poor girl, commented on how the child had brought joy to the house, but behind the scenes he sowed discord. He began to spread rumors among the employees. He insinuated that Helen was an opportunist, that she was taking advantage of Anthony's vulnerability to secure a comfortable future for herself and her daughter. He said that no one knew where she came from, that she could be a fugitive from justice, a woman of easy virtue who had abandoned her family. Be careful with that woman, folks. Too meek to be trusted, to the foreman. The boss is blind because of the girl, but sooner or later the truth will come out. The seeds of distrust were planted in fertile ground. The employees, who already looked at Helen with a certain curiosity, began to see her with different eyes. Smiles became rarer, greetings more formal. Whispers in the corridors increased, and Helen's name became a subject of hushed tones and sideways glances. Helen felt the change in the atmosphere. She felt the gazes that followed her, the silences that fell when she approached. It hurt her deeply. She, who only wanted to live in peace and raise her daughter, found herself again in the role of an intruder, an outcast. She didn't understand the reason for that sudden hostility, but she suspected Augustus was behind it. The way he looked at her, with a false smile on his lips and coldness in his eyes, made her uncomfortable. Anthony, immersed in his new happiness, was slow to perceive the web of intrigues forming around him. He was so focused on Victoria and his feelings for Helen that he paid no attention to the servants' gossip. For him, Helen's presence was a blessing, and he couldn't imagine anyone thinking otherwise. The situation reached a critical point one Sunday afternoon. The family of a neighboring rancher, the Medeiros, came to visit Sunrise. It was the first time Anthony had received visitors since Clara's death. He wanted to show Victoria to everyone, proud as a true father. The living room of the manor house was full. While the women delighted in the baby, the men talked about business and politics. Augustus, as always, was by Anthony's side, participating in the conversation, reaffirming his position as a trusted man. Helen was in a corner of the room, feeling out of place. She didn't belong in that world of rich, well-dressed people. She felt like a fish out of water, observed and judged by everyone. At one point, Mrs. Esther, the matriarch of the Medeiros, A woman known for her sharp tongue asked loudly for everyone to hear, "Anthony, my son, what a beautiful girl. But what about her mother? Who is her family? Where did she come from?" An awkward silence settled in the room. All eyes turned to Helen, who felt her face burn with shame. Anthony was preparing to answer, to defend Helen, when Augustus stepped forward with a tone of false modesty. "Mrs. Esther, Helen is a very private young woman. The boss, in his infinite kindness, took her in during a time of need. We don't know much about her past. They say she had a difficult life." The insinuation was clear. The word difficult, spoken that way, with that pause, left room for the worst interpretations. Augustus's venom had been publicly distilled, subtly but devastating. The humiliation was too much for Helen. She mumbled some excuse and left, running to her bedroom, tears finally overflowing. Anthony was furious. He realized at that instant the malice behind Augustus's words. He saw the satisfied smile on the foreman's face and understood that he had been undermining Helen's image behind his back. Anthony's blood boiled. For the first time since his widowhood, he dared to defy the customs of his own home, the social conventions that dictated a woman like Helen should not be defended. In an unexpected gesture that left everyone present speechless, he stood up and said, his voice firm and loud, so there would be no doubt, "Helen's life is no one's business but her own. What matters is who she is today, a good woman, a devoted mother, and a person for whom I have the deepest respect. And from today on, she will be treated in this house with the same consideration as any of you. Whoever disagrees, the ranch gate is open." The silence that followed was even heavier. Anthony's words echoed through the room like a sentence. He was not just defending Helen, he was publicly acknowledging his feelings for her, challenging anyone who dared to question him. Augustus turned pale. The plan had backfired. He had tried to humiliate Helen, but ended up strengthening her position and exposing his own malice. The look Anthony gave him was one of pure fury and disappointment. At that moment, Augustus knew he had lost his boss's trust. Anthony's public defense silenced the murmurs, at least for a while. No one dared to question Helen's presence on the ranch anymore. But Anthony's gesture had an even greater consequence. It ignited new feelings within him. By defending her, by taking the risk of exposing himself for her, he realized that what he felt was more than passion. It was love. A love that made him want to protect her from everything and everyone. A love that made him feel alive again. And this discovery, while scaring him, filled him with a hope he never thought he would feel again. Anthony's declaration in the living room had the effect of a bomb. The neighbors left earlier, disconcerted by the rancher's attitude. Augustus retreated to his office, brooding over the public humiliation. And in the kitchen, among the employees, there was only one top, the boss. His vehement defense of Helen left no room for doubt. For Helen, Anthony's words were both balm and torment. Hearing him defend her that way, a warmth spread through her chest. She felt protected, loved, as never before, but at the same time, fear invaded her. That gesture had made public what until then had been a veiled feeling. She knew that, from that moment on, the gazes upon her would be even more intense, and the pressure even greater. That night, Anthony went to her room. He knocked on the door and entered, his expression serious. Helen was sitting on the bed, cradling Victoria, who was asleep in her arms. "I'm sorry for what happened. I shouldn't have allowed you to go through that humiliation. It's not your fault. It's me who shouldn't be here. I don't belong in this. You belong wherever I want you to belong." With a firmness that he approached and sat on the edge of the bed. "Helen, look at me." She raised her, and what she saw in his eyes took her breath away. There was no pity, no compassion. There was desire. There was love. "I don't know what you went through before you came here," he continued, and I don't care. What matters to me is the woman standing in front of me, the strong, courageous, and kind woman I've come to admire, and whom I've come to love. Helen's heart raced. The words she had dreamed of hearing, but never believed possible, were being spoken. Tears came to her eyes, but this time they were tears of happiness. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice choked. Anthony smiled, a wide, genuine smile that transformed his face. He leaned in and kissed her. It was a tender, delicate kiss, but laden with all the repressed emotion, all the contained desire. In that kiss, they sealed a silent promise of a future together. Life at Sunrise seemed to have settled into place. The love between Anthony and Helen blossomed daily, and little Victoria was the bond that united them. But happiness, like a delicate flower, is fragile and can be destroyed by an unexpected storm. And the storm came. A few weeks later, Victoria fell ill. It started with a low fever, a persistent cough. Helen thought it was a common cold, but the fever didn't subside. The girl became listless, unwilling to nurse, her cry weak and whimpering. Panic began to take hold of Helen. Anthony called Dr. Mendez, who came from town in a hurry. After examining the child, his expression grew serious. "It's severe pneumonia," he said. "Her little lungs are very congested. It's dangerous, such a young baby." He prescribed medicine, an imported syrup that could only be found at the pharmacy in the neighboring city, several hours away by horse. But he warned that the situation was serious and that the next few hours would be decisive. Despair took over the manor house. Helen didn't leave the crib's side, holding her daughter's warm hand, praying, singing lullabies with a voice choked with tears. Anthony sent one of his fastest men to fetch the medicine, but the anguish of waiting was torturous. Night fell, and with it a torrential rain. The storm seemed to reflect the state of mind of everyone on the ranch. Lightning cut through the sky, and the sound of thunder muffled Victoria's weak cries. Near midnight, the ranch hand returned, drenched with the worst news. The bridge connecting the ranch to the main road had collapsed with the force of the rain. They were stranded, the medicine on the other side of the road, unreachable. Helen's world collapsed. She clung to Anthony, sobbing, "She's going to die, Anthony." "My daughter is going to die." "Don't say that." He hugged her tightly. "We'll find a way. She's strong. She'll make it." But as the hours passed, Victoria worsened. The fever rose higher and higher, and her breathing became more difficult, a suffering wheeze that broke their hearts. Helen, in her mother's desperation, made a drastic decision. She couldn't stay there, doing nothing, watching her daughter. She remembered a shortcut, a dangerous trail through the woods that led to a small village on the other side of the mountain. It was a long and risky path, even more so with that storm. But in the village there was a small apothecary that might have similar medicine. It was her only hope. While Anthony and the other men tried to find a way to cross the river, Helen acted. She grabbed a raincoat, a canteen of water, and, without anyone noticing, slipped out the back door and plunged into the dark. Rainy woods. The walk was hell. The rain lashed her face. The mud made the path slippery, and tree branches scratched her skin. She fell several times, got up, driven by a force that only a mother's love can explain. The fear of the darkness, of animals, of getting lost, was nothing compared to the fear of losing her daughter. She walked all night, through the storm, guided only by her memory and her determination. At dawn, exhausted, drenched, and covered in mud, she finally spotted the first houses of the village. She ran to the apothecary, her heart in her mouth. To her relief, the old pharmacist had the medicine. With the small bottle in her hands, as if holding destiny itself, she made her way back. The sun had already risen, and the rain had lessened, but her strength was at its end. Each step was a superhuman effort. When she finally reached the courtyard of Sunrise Ranch, Anthony saw her. He had spent the night awake, desperate, not only for his daughter's illness, but also for Helen's disappearance. Seeing her in that state, his heart broke, not for her fragility, but for her strength, for the proof of love she had just given. He ran to meet her and caught her in his arms before she... "Are you crazy?" he said, his voice a mixture of anger and relief. "You could have died." "I needed to save our daughter," she read, her voice weak, before losing consciousness in his arms. That act of courage and desperation by Helen was the third turning point in their story, and the fourth came soon after, when the medicine she had brought with such sacrifice began to take effect. Victoria's fever subsided, her breathing improved, and the next day she was out of danger. The entire ranch celebrated, but for Anthony, the sight of Helen arriving, exhausted and drenched, holding that small bottle, was an image he would never forget. At that moment, something crumbled within him. All his defenses, all his doubts, all the fear of loving again, all of it dissolved. He understood that the love he felt for that woman was greater than his grief, greater than his conventions, greater than himself. It was a love worth any risk, any sacrifice, and he was ready to live it, no matter what the future held for them. Victoria's recovery brought immense relief to Sunrise Ranch. The girl, strong like her mother, soon returned to smiling and filling the house with her contagious joy. Helen's heroic act, risking her own life to save her daughter, elevated her to a new level in everyone's eyes. Employees, who once looked at her with distrust, now saw her with admiration and respect. She had ceased to be the outsider and had become the ranch's hero for Anthony and Helen. The experience of almost losing their daughter further strengthened the bonds between them. The love they felt for each other deepened, becoming more mature and conscious. They began to live their relationship openly, regardless of what others might. They walked hand in hand through the fields, exchanged knowing glances during meals, and their nights were filled with conversations and affections that healed both their wounds. However, this happiness deeply bothered one person. Augustus, the foreman who already harbored a veiled hatred for Helen, felt increasingly isolated and threatened. Anthony's public defense, followed by the episode of Victoria's illness, only served to consolidate Helen's position on and in his. Augustus realized that his subtle methods of defamation were not working. On the contrary, they seemed to strengthen the couple's union even more. Consumed by envy and the fear of definitively losing his power, he decided he needed a more powerful weapon to destroy Helen's reputation and separate her from Anthony. He needed something that would irrevocably shake the boss's trust, and for that, he was willing to play dirty. Augustus spent days orchestrating his plan. He knew that Helen's greatest vulnerability was her unknown past. That was where he should attack. If he couldn't find real evidence against her, he would invent it. On one of his trips to town, he sought out an old accomplice, a man known for his skill in forgeries. He paid a good sum for him to forge a letter, with feminine handwriting and aged paper, that would appear authentic. The letter was anonymous, supposedly written by a friend concerned about Anthony's well-being. The content was venomous, calculated to wound the rancher at his most sensitive point, his pride and the memory of his late wife. The letter stated that Helen was not who she appeared to be. It claimed that her real name was different, that she had fled her hometown after being involved in a scandal, being known for seducing rich men and then abandoning them. It insinuated that the powerful married man, and that Helen had fled to hide the pregnancy and pull the same trick on another fool. The letter ended with a cruel phrase, "Don't let this woman of ill repute stain the memory of the Honorable Mrs. Clara." With the letter in hand, Augustus waited for the right moment to act. He placed it in an unmarked envelope and left it on Anthony's office desk, among other correspondence, so that he would find it as if it had arrived by mail. And the plan worked. The next morning, Anthony found the letter. As he read it, his world collapsed. Every word was like a dagger in his chest. Doubt, a subtle and corrosive poison, began to infiltrate his mind. He tried to rationalize. He knew Augustus hated him. He was capable of anything to harm Helen. But the letter was so detailed, so plausible. And Helen's past was, in fact, a blank book. She had never spoken about Victoria's father, never given details about her life before arriving at the ranch. This silence, which he had once respected, now became suspicious. The seeds of distrust planted by Augustus months earlier, and which seemed to have been eradicated by love, now found fertile ground in Anthony's insecurity. The mention of Clara hit him hard. Was he really being foolish? Was he blind with passion, to the point of allowing an adventuress to take the place of his beloved wife? Doubt consumed him. He looked at Helen, and instead of seeing the woman he loved, he saw the woman described in the letter. He saw an actress, an impostor. Every gesture of affection, every word of love now seemed false, calculated. Anthony's behavior changed drastically. He became cold, distant. He stopped seeking her out, talking to her, playing with Victoria. Silence settled between them, a heavy silence, more painful than any spoken word. Helen didn't understand what was happening. Overnight, the man who loved her had transformed into a stranger. She tried to talk, asked what was wrong, but he rebuffed her with monosyllabic answers or with a cutting silence. "What did I do, Anthony?" She, desperate. "Nothing," he replied, without looking at her. "I'm just tired." The pain of rejection was unbearable for Helen. She felt confused, lost. The paradise she had found at sunrise had turned into a hell of uncertainty and anguish. She relived every moment, every conversation in her mind, trying to find a mistake she had made, a word that could have caused that change, but she found. Augustus observed the situation with a triumphant smile. His plan had worked. Discord was established. It was a matter of time before Anthony exploded and sent Helen away from the ranch. Days dragged on, and the abyss between the couple only widened. The manor house, which had come back to life, plunged again into an atmosphere of sadness and tension. Mrs. Lucia and the other maids noticed Helen's suffering, and Anthony's cold. They dared not. Anthony was in an internal battle. Part of him wanted to believe in Helen, in the love he felt for her, but the other part, wounded by pride, by doubt, couldn't shake off the words of that. He felt betrayed, deceived, and the pain was so great that he preferred to withdraw rather than confront the truth, whatever it might be. The fifth turning point of the story had occurred. The forged letter by Augustus had achieved its objective, and the love that seemed unshakable was now hanging by a thread, threatened by the poison of distrust. Well, Helen, once again, found herself alone and helpless, a victim of an injustice she didn't even know. And Anthony, prisoner of his own doubt, distanced himself more and more from the woman who had brought joy back into his life. The silence between them was a minefield, where every false step could lead to the definitive destruction of that love. Time, with its relentless slowness, seemed only to deepen the open wound between Anthony and Helen. His coldness was a constant torture for her, who retreated to the room with Victoria, crying in silence so that her daughter wouldn't know. Joy had abandoned the manor house, giving way to a palpable tension that affected everyone. Augustus, the architect of that misery, savored his victory. He saw the couple suffering as a trophy, proof of his intelligence and power. He had reapproached Anthony, offering a friendly shoulder, poisoning him further with disingenuous comments. "I told the boss that woman wasn't of good character," in a tone of false concern, "but a man's heart is sometimes blind." Anthony, confused and hurt, listened to Augustus, seeing him again as his only ally, his faithful counselor. The anonymous letter continued to haunt him, and the image of Helen as an impostor solidified in his mind. However, the truth has a curious way of coming, often through the most unexpected paths. And the sixth turning point of this story began to unfold in the hands of one of the simplest and most discreet people on the ranch, Mary, a young maid who worked in the manor house. Mary was an observant and kind-hearted girl. She was very fond of Helen, and had grown attached to little Victoria. Her protector's suffering distressed her, and she couldn't come to terms with the sudden change in the boss's behavior. Intuitively, she felt that something was wrong, an injustice in the air. One day, while cleaning Augustus's office, something caught her attention. In a small wastebasket next to the desk, she saw several crumpled pieces of paper. They were drafts, attempts to imitate handwriting. Curiosity was stronger than prudence. Mary picked up the papers and put them in her apron pocket. Later, in her room, she put the pieces together like a jigsaw puzzle. What she saw shocked her. They were fragments of phrases, loose words, very similar to those she had caught by chance, seen in the letter that Mrs. Lucia had found in Anthony's office wastebasket days after the crisis began. Lucia, unaware of its contents, had commented to the other maids about the strange letter the boss had then angrily. Mary put the pieces together. Augustus practicing handwriting, an anonymous letter appearing, the boss changing completely. The truth began to form in her mind, clear and frightening. Augustus had forged the letter. Fear paralyzed her. What should she do? Augustus was a powerful man on the ranch. If she accused him without concrete evidence, he could fire her, or worse. But on the other hand, how could she remain silent, seeing the injustice being committed against Helen? After a sleepless night, courage overcame fear. Mary sought out the only person she fully trusted, Mrs. Lucia. She told her everything she had discovered, showed her the papers. The old woman, life wisdom, had no doubts. "That treacherous snake! I knew he had a hand in this story," Lucia said, indignant. "We need to tell the boss everything, right now." The two went together to the manor. They found Anthony on the porch, his gaze lost on them, his face marked by anguish. "Boss, we need to speak with you. It's a very serious matter." Mrs. Lucia. Anthony looked at, surprised by the formality. He invited them in and asked them to sit. Mary, trembling, told him everything she had seen, handing the drafts to Anthony. Looked at the papers, his face transforming with each of Mary's words. Rage, shame, and regret flooded him like an overwhelming wave. How could he have been so blind? How could he have doubted the woman he loved and believed the lies of a man he now saw as a traitor? The image of Helen, crying in the suffering in her eyes, the way he had treated her with coldness and contempt, all of it came to his mind, and a deep pain struck him. He had been cruel, unjust. He had caused immense suffering to the woman who had saved his daughter and who had given him back the will to live. Where is she? In the stable. Boss, she goes there every afternoon, to be alone. Anthony stood up and rushed out without another word. He ran as he had never run before, his heart pounding uncontrollably, the need to ask for forgiveness more urgent than the air he breathed. He found her in the same place where he had seen her for the first time, sitting on a bale of hay, her gaze sad, lost in the void. The setting was the same, but this time there was no fear in her eyes, only a serene firmness, a dignity that humiliation had not managed to shake. He stopped at the stable entrance, out of breath. Helen saw him and flinched, as if expecting another harsh word, another look of contempt. But what Anthony did left her speechless. He walked slowly towards her and, to her complete surprise, knelt at her feet. "Helen, forgive me," he said, his voice broken, tears streaming down his face. She looked at him, confused, not understanding what was happening. "I was a fool, a blind man," he continued, holding her hands. "I doubted you. I believed lies. I let a bad man's poison enter my heart. I hurt you. I humiliated you. I don't deserve your love. But I beg you, forgive me." He told her about the letter, about Augustus's, about how he had let himself be led astray by doubt. Helen listened, the pieces of the puzzle finally fitting together, the coldness, the distance. It all made sense now. She looked at the man kneeling at her feet, the proud rancher, stripped of all his arrogance, begging for her forgiveness, and in her heart there was no room for resentment. There was only love and compassion for that man who, like her, was also a victim of his own weaknesses. With a gentle gesture, she made him stand up. "I forgive you, Anthony," she was sweet and serene. He hugged her, a strong, desperate embrace, as if he wanted to merge their bodies into one, as if he wanted, in that hug, to erase all the pain he had caused. "Helen, I love you more than anything in my life," he whispered in her ear. "I love you too," she crying and laughing in that stable, where their story had begun amidst fear and distrust. It began anew, now sealed by forgiveness and the certainty of a love that had survived the hardest of trials. The truth had set them free. They were ready to build, together, a future where there would be no more room for shadows or doubts. Anthony's forgiveness was not just for having doubted, but for having loved in silence for so long, and now he was ready to shout that love for the whole world to hear. The reconciliation between Anthony and Helen was like a new dawn for Sunrise Ranch. The cloud of sadness that hung over the manor house dissipated, giving way to an atmosphere of joy and renewal. Anthony's first act, the next day, was to summon Augustus to his office. The foreman entered the room with his usual air of superiority, unaware of what awaited him. Anthony sat behind his desk, face set, his blue eyes blazing with cold fury. On the desk lay the drafts of the forged letter. "I know what you did, Augustus," Owen cutting. Augustus's face paled. He tried to deny it, stammered excuses, but Anthony's gaze left no room for lies. "Pack your things and get off my ranch. And be grateful I'm not turning you over to the police," Anthony said. "You have 1 hour." Augustus left the office humiliated, defeated. News of his dismissal and its reasons spread through the ranch like wildfire. No one mourned his departure. Justice, though late, had been served. With Augustus out of the way, a new chapter began for everyone. Anthony, as if to compensate for lost time and the pain he had caused, began to treat Helen not as a dependent, but as the lady of the house, and he made sure everyone knew it. The seventh turning point came with the change in Anthony's behavior and, consequently, that of the household. He began to walk alongside Helen through the fields, something he had never done before. He showed her the property limits, explained the planting and harvesting cycles, taught her the names of the trees and birds. He wasn't just sharing his knowledge, he was sharing his world. More than that, he began to listen to her opinions. Helen, with her sensitivity and practical intelligence, had surprising ideas. She suggested creating a small organic garden to supply the kitchen, organizing a daycare for the employees' children during harvest, renovating the ranch chapel. Anthony not only listened but put her ideas into practice, proud of his partner's wisdom. This partnership, visible to all, changed the social dynamic of the ranch. The neighboring town commented on the new mistress of Sunrise, some with envy, others with admiration, but no one dared to question Helen's. Anthony's attitude made it clear that she was the woman of his life, the mother of his adopted daughter, and the future lady of those lands. The eighth turning point came with the definitive acceptance of the employees. Once suspicious and influenced by Augustus's lies, they began to see Helen with different eyes. They saw her dedication to the ranch, her affection for Victoria, her kindness to everyone, regardless of their position. She was not an arrogant mistress, but a natural leader who commanded by example and respect. Mrs. Lucia was the first to formalize this change. One day, while serving dinner, instead of addressing only Anthony, she turned to Helen and asked, "Would you like more dessert, ma'am?" The use of ma'am was a recognition, a symbolic coronation. From that day on, everyone began to treat her as the lady of the house, and Helen, though still a little self-conscious, accepted her new role with the humility and grace that characterized her. She became the heart of the ranch. She organized the seasonal festivals, cared for the sick, mediated small conflicts among the workers. The manor house, once a dark and silent place, became a home again. Victoria's laughter echoed through the corridors. The smell of baking cake perfumed the afternoon, and Helen's serene presence brought peace and harmony to everyone. Anthony observed everything. He rediscovered happiness in simple things, seeing Helen playing with Victoria in the garden, hearing her humming in the kitchen, feeling the warmth of her hand in his during evening walks. He felt like a complete man, as if life had given him a second chance. But, amidst all this happiness, a shadow still lingered in Helen's heart, an unease she couldn't ignore. She loved Anthony. She loved that life, but something bothered her. She lived on that ranch, was treated as the lady of the house. But, deep down, she felt that all of it was a gift, a concession of Anthony's kindness. She lived under the shadow of gratitude. She was Victoria's mother, Anthony's woman, the mistress of Sunrise. But who was Helen? What was her identity? beyond the roles life had imposed on her. She didn't want to be just the woman who had been taken in, the former helpless. She wanted to be a woman who built her own destiny, who stood beside Anthony by choice, not out of dependence. This feeling, this need to find herself, to assert herself as an individual, began to grow within her. It was a seed of independence sprouting in her heart, watered by the very love and respect Anthony had given her. He had made her feel so valued that now she needed to prove to herself that she was worthy of that value on her own merits. She began to think of leaving, not to abandon him, but to go away for a while, to find her own path, perhaps to fulfill her old dream of being a teacher, to be able to return one day, not as the woman he had saved, but as his equal, a companion in every sense of the word. This decision matured in silence, would be the ninth and perhaps most difficult turning point in a final test for the love. She knew it would break Anthony's, but she felt it was a necessary step for her own integrity and for the solidity of the future they could build together. The woman who had once arrived at that ranch with nothing now felt the need to leave too. Finally, the decision to leave ripened in Helen's heart like a bitter fruit. Every smile from Victoria, every affectionate gesture from Anthony made her plan more difficult, more painful. How could she abandon the happiness she had finally found? But the need to feel whole, not to live forever under the weight of gratitude, was stronger. She didn't want her love for Anthony to be confused with dependence. She wanted to love him in freedom, as a woman who chose to be by his, and not as someone who had no other option. She began to prepare in secret. She saved the few earnings she had made from selling embroidery and sweets. She wrote letters to schools in neighboring towns, inquiring about the possibility of working as a teacher's aide. She had no diploma, but she could read and write well and had a genuine love for teaching. The ninth turning point of her journey was about to happen, and she planned it for an early morning, just like her arrival. The darkness and silence would be her witnesses, accomplices to a departure that was not an escape, but a quest. On the chosen night, she couldn't sleep. She spent hours watching Victoria, who slept peacefully in her crib. She kissed her forehead, her cheeks, tiny hands, trying to commit every detail to memory. She left a letter on Anthony's pillow, a long letter, full of love and pain, explaining her reasons. She said she loved him more than anything, but that she needed to find herself to be the woman he deserved. She promised to return once she felt strong enough to stand beside him as his equal. With a broken heart, she picked up her small bundle of clothes and silently walked out of it. The full moon illuminated the yard, and the ranch slept in. Each step towards the gate was torture. The urge to run back, to throw herself into Anthony's arms and forget that craving, was immense, but she resisted. When she reached the large wooden gate that marked the exit of Sunrise, her heart stopped. There, standing still as a statue under the moonlight, was Anthony. He didn't seem surprised. His face was calm, but his eyes revealed a deep sadness. He had been. "You didn't think I'd let you leave like this without saying goodbye, did you?" His deep voice breaking the silence of the early morning. Helen was paralyzed, unsure what to say. How did he know? "I know you, Helen," he continued, as if reading her thoughts. "I've seen the restlessness in your eyes these past few days. I knew something was bothering you, and I understand. I understand that you need to find your place in the world, a place that is solely yours." The tears Helen had held back with such effort finally came. "I love you, Anthony, but I can't live forever as the woman you saved in the stable," said between sobs. He approached and wiped her tears with his thumb. "You were never just that to me. You were the woman who saved me from my own darkness. But if you need to go to believe that, I won't stop you." He held her hands in his. "But I want you to know one thing. I don't love you out of gratitude. I love you for who you are. And this house, this ranch, this world, they only make sense because you are in them. I no longer want to live within walls that don't see you." His words hit her hard. "I no longer want to live within walls that don't see you." It was the most beautiful and profound declaration of love she had ever heard. It was proof that he truly saw her. He saw the woman, not the helpless one. An absolute silence fell between them, broken only by the wind rustling the trees and the distant sound of the corral bell, announcing that a new day was about to begin. "Don't go, Helen," he pleaded, his voice now supplicating. "Stay, stay, and build your place here, by my side, not as my protected one, but as my partner, my companion, my wife. Let's transform this ranch together. Let's raise our daughter together. Your dream of teaching? Why not build a school right here, for the employees' children? You would be the teacher. You would bring the light of knowledge to this land. That would be your place, a place built by you, for you." Anthony's proposal was more than Helen had ever dreamed of. A school, to be a teacher on her own land, to build something of her own, something that would make a difference. He wasn't just asking her to stay. He was offering her the tools to realize her dreams. He was giving her the independence but without her having to give up love. She looked into his eyes, sincerity, respect, admiration. She saw a man who didn't want to imprison her, but to see her fly. And she understood that her place in the world was not a geographical point, but a feeling. It was to be where her heart felt at home. And her home was there, beside that man and that girl. She smiled, a smile that lit up the early morning. "I'll stay." Anthony hugged her, and the relief and happiness they felt at that moment were indescribable. The ninth turning point was not the departure, but the decision to stay and fight, together, for a future where both could be whole and free. The 10th and final turning point happened months later, on the day of the inauguration of the small ranch school named Sunrise School. The Manor House Hall, once a stage for sadness and solitude, was lit by chandeliers filled with people. The employees and their families celebrated. Children ran everywhere, happy with the new addition. Helen, now officially the teacher to walk, was radiant. Anthony, by her side, looked at her with an overflowing love. In the middle of the party, Victoria, now a healthy and smiling little girl, took her first steps. She walked clumsily towards her parents, who waited for her with open arms. Anthony lifted her into his arms and kissed her, his heart bursting with happiness. He looked at Helen, who was crying with emotion, and understood me with absolute clarity. That love had come into his life, not like a destructive storm, but like the dawn he so appreciated, a silent, inevitable, and definitive love, born of compassion and the courage to stay. Life at Sunrise Ranch found its rhythm again, but it was a different melody, richer and more harmonious. The manor house, which for so long had been a mausoleum of painful memories, now pulsed with the energy of a new family. The scent of wax-polished furniture mingled with the smell of chalk from the small school, and the echo of footsteps on the wooden floor was frequently interrupted by the laughter of Victoria and her new classmate. Helen, the woman once found abandoned in the stable, had become the pulsing heart of the ranch. As a teacher, she not only taught reading and writing, she taught about respect for the land, the importance of dreams, the strength that exists within everyone. The children adored her, and their parents, once illiterate, began to attend evening classes, proud to learn to sign their own names. Helen had brought more than knowledge. She had brought dignity. Anthony's, in turn, was a new man. The stern rancher, cloistered in his own pain, had given way to a smiling and engaged man. He threw himself heart and soul into the school project, helping to build desks, fetching books from town, telling stories to the children. Alongside Helen, he learned to share not only his lands, but also his feelings, his fears, and his hopes. Their wedding was a simple ceremony held in the renovated ranch chapel with all the employees present. There was no luxury or ostentation, just the celebration of a true love that had overcome all barriers. When the priest declared them husband and wife, Anthony looked at Helen and knew he had found his safe harbor, and she, looking at him, knew she had finally found her place in the world. Victoria grew visibly an intelligent and affectionate girl who called Anthony Dad with a naturalness that filled his heart with joy. She was the living symbol of that story of redemption, proof that from the ashes of pain, the most beautiful flowers can bloom. The ranch prospered like never before. Helen's ideas, combined with Anthony's experience, brought innovations that improved production and the lives of everyone. The organic garden became a success, and the daycare allowed mothers to work with more peace of mind. Sunrise became a model for the region, a place where progress and respect walked hand in hand. One sunny afternoon, years later, Anthony and Helen sat on the porch, watching Victoria, now a young lady, running through the fields with other children. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky with warm, vibrant colors. "Remember the first time I saw you?" Anthony asked, holding her hand. "That cold morning, in the stable." Helen smiled. "How could I forget? I was so scared." "And so was I," he confessed. "I was afraid to feel anything again. You arrived and turned my world upside down. I think we both needed our worlds turned upside down," she, leaning her head on his shoulder. They sat in silence for a while, just enjoying the moment they had built together. Anthony, the man who had once found a helpless woman among, had discovered that true love doesn't arrive with fanfare like a storm. It is born of silence, of the courage to forgive, and above all, of the courage to stay. Helen was no longer the outsider, and he was no longer the embittered widower. They were just two people who found each other, healed each other, and learned to love. And that was the only story. So, did you enjoy this breathtaking story? If Helen and Anthony's journey touched your heart, don't keep that emotion all to yourself. Subscribe to our channel now so you don't miss any of the upcoming narratives we've lovingly prepared. Give us a like to let us know you were here. Most importantly, comment below what you would have done in Anthony's place. Your opinion is the special spice of our community. See you in the next story.